Well, good morning once again. My name is Keith. I'm the lead and teaching pastor here at Grassroots Church, and we are a community of people who truly are learning to spread the selfless love of Jesus across the face of the earth. And one way that we do that is through the reading of the Word, opening of the Scriptures to see what God would have to say to us through them. I've been preaching for the last many weeks on the mystery and the gift of marriage. And this is week 4 of 5. There's one more week to go after this before we finish this series. So if you missed any of it, I invite you to go back and scroll through the Grassroots Home Church homepage to find the rest of the sermons. What I've been saying so far is that marriage is like a crucible. God has put a crucible-like dynamic into marriage, which is meant to test us and to shape us and to grow the selfless love of Jesus into our hearts. And how can we spread the selfless love of Jesus across the earth if that's not beginning in our homes? And not only do we have a responsibility to love each other selflessly in our homes, but when we don't, and when we find that hard and difficult, we embrace and realize that God is using our relationships and the conflicts in our relationships to shape and mold us. So today we're going to jump straight into Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 33. These are like the hotspot scriptures in all of the Bible, really, about marriage, about what God has to say about marriage. And so for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to ask one crucial question, because this is the one question which really remains for us, is if God is using our difficult experiences in our closest relationships to shape us, to grow us, how do we join him? What do we do to tend to that work of God? Do we have a role in that at all? And asking, what are some practical ways that we should respond out of the awareness that God is working on us? And the two ideas that really pop out to us in the marriage relationship are compassion and mutual submission. The choice to engage in empathetic kinds of behaviors and practices, as well as choosing on our own will and our own ways to submit to one another out of mutual love. So we're going to look at these each in turn. We're going to look at compassion this week and mutual submission next week. Now, I've had my fair share of relational conflicts in my life. Over the years, people who I've loved and highly regarded, finding myself in a very complicated and confusing set of relational conflicts with them. And the people that I've treasured the most, the people that we've come through our conflicts, we've not just learned how to tell the truth to one another and to forgive one another, but we come through them and our relationship is stronger and more resilient on the other side. These are the kinds of people I've found that are able to engage compassion and empathy. And you don't have to be a psychologist to know that some of our biggest fears have to do with people misunderstanding us or misrepresenting us. And some of our biggest fans in life, some of our biggest fans who have cheered us on have been our parents. For guys, it's no surprise that oftentimes it's the mother in the relationship who has shown a lot of empathy and compassion and confidence in their sons. And for girls, oftentimes there's that kind of similar relationship with the father, where the father delights in the daughter and she can do no wrong almost. And for those of you who haven't had parents in your life who have invested in you empathetically, you know the kind of pain that you experience in missing this kind of investment in your life. And so we really treasure those people who learn to empathize with us. And the people who do well in empathy, they take time to consider what other people's experiences may have been like. They know how to be fully present with another person, even in a room that is filled with other people in a crowded space. Empathetic people know how not to rush through life, and they leave space and time and energy for listening. They don't give a lot of unsolicited advice, but they ask a lot of questions. And empathetic people really know the power of curiosity. A crucial part of my story has to do with going to a Bible camp, a Young Life camp, at the age of 14. And I've told this story in other places. I'm not going to tell the whole thing here. It's a really good story about the way God takes a person who has a vague awareness, a child who has a vague awareness of God and God's work in this world, and brings them close and calls them. And what God did to me when I was 14 was open my eyes to what it could look like to be a real Christian, to really be practicing this faith rather than just pretending. And what happened on that trip, one of the significant pieces is a very mundane and kind of gross thing, actually. I had come down with a really significant cough. I had some respiratory, I had a bug in my respiratory tract. And I was supposed to go to this camp we'd been planning on going for months. And the night of the night before, I had an extremely awful cough. I had a temperature. I was sick. And the leader knew this about me, but also knew that he was going to do whatever it took to get me to this camp, because he knew what this experience was going to be like. Now, obviously, today in the situation that we're in, this would never happen. But imagine packing me inside a 15-passenger van with other 14-year-olds, just terribly sick. And what happened was we left at, I think, 9 p.m. one night and drove all the way from Illinois to northern Minnesota. And the whole way there, I had gone through 2 or 3 boxes of Kleenexes. I was on the left-hand side. I was on the driver's side, right behind the driver's side, blowing my nose all night long and just coughing, hacking up a lung. We arrived the next morning, early in the morning. And by the time we got there, there's this pile of Kleenexes. Now, at these camps, what happens is once you arrive, there's no rest for the weary. They almost pull you out of the vans in excitement. And at this particular camp, because we were in the land of 10,000 lakes, they tossed us right onto a jet ski, put a life jacket on us, and off we went, leaving the leaders to clear out the van. This leader, it didn't even dawn upon me till many, many years later that this leader had spent part of his time cleaning out my oily, disgusting Kleenexes. And I don't know how he did it, or how he learned to experience empathy or compassion for me. But he was, in a very self-sacrificial way, serving me and looking on me with compassion. And he didn't let on the whole week that he had to do that. So basically, we're going to jump right in with this idea of compassion in close relationships. In these verses, in Ephesians 5:21 through 33, Paul is talking about the dynamics of being filled with the Holy Spirit. He's asking, how do we act now? What can we do to be the hands and feet of God in this world when love is sometimes difficult? And his answer to this question is, the Spirit helps us. The Holy Spirit is with us and lives with us and helps us in the most difficult of times. Paul says, watch how you behave. Watch carefully. Don't be unwise, but wise, making the most of the time you have, because the days are evil. Because of this, don't be foolish, but discern what God's will is. Don't get drunk on wine, which is a slavish, reckless way of living, but be filled with the Spirit of God. Paul is warning us that there are a lot of distractions out there in this world that may seem intriguing, that may capture our imaginations and capture our attention, but there's a lot of hidden evil in the world crouching in the hidden corners of the movies we watch and the things that we read and the time that we spend in this world that is unwise. Of course, we need downtime, and entertainment's okay, but Paul's saying there's a lot of hidden evil out there, and we have to use our hearts and our minds and our brains, our whole discerning self, to figure out where that evil is. And we need to spend that time well, recognizing that being a Christian involves regular check-ins with our spiritual health. See to it, Paul says, that you are walking wisely. He's going to say that being filled with the Spirit is the ultimate goal, or the ultimate reality that we find ourselves in, and that we're going to tap into the power of God. Do you want to tap into the power of God? He says there's 4 ways to do it: public worship, private worship, prayer, specifically thanksgiving, and the 4th one doesn't seem like it fits in this list. The first few are praise and prayer and those kind of things that we usually associate with the churchy things that we do. But the fourth way to engage the power of God and to be filled with His Spirit is to choose to submit to one another mutually. And this is the jumping off point for his great teaching on marriage. He's telling us submitting to one another in reverence for Jesus is a way of being filled with the Spirit of God. And if you're paying attention, if you're really paying attention to what Paul just said, your back should be up against the wall in 2 seconds flat. This is a call to a radical, selfless orientation, which touches the deepest part of ourselves, that symbolic heart, that deepest part, the well of our emotions and personhood. This is a teaching that touches that, and we don't like that place of us touched. Paul's saying, you mean I need to entrust my most valuable and vulnerable and sacred parts of myself to another person who Paul just got done describing? Read chapter 4. He just got done describing the list of what humans are like. Specifically, they are hard-hearted. Specifically, they are people who are easily deceived, are twisted around in lies very easily. And they are people who can be sucked very easily into bitter complaining. Paul says this is the kind of person who you need to choose to submit to. This should be a very challenging teaching for us. In other words, the choice for mutual submission is like a baptismal experience designed to form love in us, which I'm going to speak directly about next week, the kind of self-sacrificial giving that marriage requires. But there's something here first, which we need to get a hold of if we're going to choose to submit to one another, which is compassion. Paul's going to talk about what mutual submission and compassion look like between a husband and wife. But the greatness of this scripture passage is in what seems sometimes like Paul's first obsession with the church's call to be like Jesus in our love. Paul is teaching on marriage here, how a husband and a wife should interact. But at some point he's going to slip, his attention is going to slip into an obsession on Jesus' love for the church. And that Jesus is the bride and the church is the bridegroom. And we find that a huge part of the marriage relationship is mustering the same compassion that Christ had for us. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Yes, this is addressed to husbands, and I think there's a good reason why this is specifically addressed to husbands, which I'll get into next time. But I think also this is something that Paul is teaching everyone. Anyone who feels the call upon their life, the call of the Master to love other people as you would love yourself. This is for us all. Paul goes on, he gave himself up for her and made her holy by the cleansing of the washing of the water by the word. And his whole desire was to get her ready for presentation, to ready her for himself as a glorious bride, not having stain or wrinkle or anything like this, but that she might be holy and spotless. We could spend a lot of time exegeting this passage, but I think it's best here to say simply that these ideas can be summed up with one word, one idea: compassion. And the question I'm asking today is, how do we help maintain compassion in our marriage relationships, in our marriage situations? And these kind of break down into a couple different teaching areas. The first one is listening, and the second one has to do with imagination, engaging in imagination. So the listening practices. Any healthy marriage, I believe, any marriage that is regularly honoring its marital vows is going to involve a significant amount of time devoted to listening to one another. And we're listening, what exactly are we listening for? I think we listen for a couple things. We listen for the fears, the greatest fears that our spouse operates under. And we listen for childhood experiences, because our childhood experiences really wire us and shape us into the people that we are. When you think of someone who gets married at 20, they've had 20 years of childhood formation. It's going to be another 20 years before they reach the same amount of time. And we are extremely pliable, way more in our first 20 years than we are in our second 20 years. So I would suggest regularly coming back to this question. What are your greatest fears? Teach me about them. I want to know all about them and how they operate. And tell me about your childhood. How did that work? How did that shape you? Who are you today because of that? And oftentimes people don't know the answers themselves to these questions. And so I'm not suggesting that this is going to be a one-time shot. Like you sit down and you say, tell me your greatest fear. What is your childhood like? It's 24 hours later. I've just heard your whole life testimony, and I'm going to forget it tomorrow because I'm a selfish, self-oriented creature. So we need to get this information over the course of a long dance of conversation. But I would suggest focusing on those. If you don't know where to start, sit down one day with a cup of coffee, or whether you're falling asleep one night, and just say, tell me about what are you afraid of in life? What's your biggest fears? And don't just stop with a simple answer. See if you can dig into that a little bit. Really, this whole way of being is about becoming a scholar of your spouse. The second thing really has to do with practices of imagination, actively exerting and using our imagination. It's a really important part of keeping a healthy marriage. And this is especially true in times of conflict. When our spouse or the person that we're living close with, when they kind of turn against us, or when they misunderstand us, or when they're at their worst, it's very easy to vilify them, to make them out to be malicious, and like their motives are malicious and they're out for harm. And these are the moments where we have to exert a lot of empathy and compassion. And so the kind of things that we use our imaginations about is if a person's acting poorly towards us, or if a person's acting poorly in general, we have to imagine what it would take for us to act likewise. Imagine that if you felt threatened, if you felt like you were being, your whole sort of world was being threatened, would you act the same way? Would you do the same thing? You have to take time to ponder what your spouse's experience may be like. This is not just a momentary turning on of empathy. This is a really strong and ongoing process and practice. That's why journaling can be so important, because we've got to take time to get ourselves into another person's shoes. When a person begins to dislike you, or they're throwing conflict and criticism your way, it's very easy to act out of a defensive kind of self. But we have to learn to grow up and not act out of a defensive self, to learn to become adults and learn to speak with one another with empathy. And so one of the ways to do this is, even if a person is criticizing you, even if it's exaggerated or blown out of proportion, try to think they're probably telling you something that's true about you. You have to recognize that you are likely a part of the conflict that's happening in your marriage. You have to look at yourself and see what another person sees from their point of view. So empathy is not just about, and compassion isn't just about learning to become a scholar of someone else, but learning to see their conflict with you, get outside of your brain, outside of yourself, and see what they may be experiencing. But ultimately, this is learning to respect the thoughts and feelings of your spouse. It means, I love this quote, it means understanding how a flawed fellow human being acting out of an excess of defensiveness or poor impulse control could have made a mistake. It means feeling with another person. Last thing I'm going to say is this takes a lot of investment. To listen, to spend the time listening to someone, devoting that kind of space, and to learning to imagine what it must be like to be another person isn't just something that happens easily. It takes work, it takes devotion, it takes practice. But that's why love is one of the best things, one of the greatest things in all of the universe, is because it takes work. It takes devotion. It takes all of us. And if we're not willing to give all of us, we won't have access to it. And I'm just sort of, in my own life and in the lives of the people closest to me that I've pastoral access to, it's amazing to me how many people will be able to put up over and over and over again with the same patterns of painful distancing and fighting with one another. They're able to put up with a great amount of pain and still not be able to invest and do something about the cycles that we find ourselves in. And we can do something about them. We can change them. We can do this, especially with compassion. So I'm going to say one more thing here and just read a little bit of an excerpt from a book that I find very powerful. The book is called Impasse to Intimacy, and I'll put a picture here up for you so you know what I'm reading for it. I'm going to finish off with a little bit of a reading here for us today. It's near the end of the book, and it just simply describes a couple who learn to be empathetic with one another. Aaron and Laura. The story of Aaron and Laura. Aaron had an affair 5 years before he and Laura came to see me. This is from the perspective of a therapist. When she found out about the affair, Laura had a retaliatory affair of her own. But as she put it, mine was just a one-night stand, while he was really involved with somebody. Their relationship had never really recovered. Affairs are very difficult for relationships. Sometimes they cannot recover at all. I felt that Aaron and Laura wished that they could put it in the past and let go of it, but something was in their way. Laura was very reluctant to talk about the past. It's not what he did that I'm still mad about, she says. It's his attitude. I think he has a real double standard. Sometimes I think his affair was no big deal to him, but that he's never forgiven me for mine. I asked her how she knows this. Well, he won't talk about it, she said. To this day, when I bring it up, he changes the subject. She was certainly right as far as I could see. Aaron maintained that it was best not to dredge up the past. But his apparent imperviousness was a defense against reliving emotional pain, and that under that defense was a well of self-torment. I tried to get Aaron to talk about his affair, but he resisted me, too. I don't see what's the use. I believe that if you make a mistake, you live by it. I hurt Laura, and I don't believe she'll ever trust me again. Aaron could not ask for forgiveness because he could not forgive himself. And his defensive self believed it was safer to live with the assumption that he would never be trusted than to risk opening up and be hurt by Laura's anger or rejection. I told him I thought Laura might be more ready to forgive him than he was ready to forgive himself. He looked to Laura to confirm this, and she nodded. I never knew you felt bad. I always thought you hated me, that you blamed me for your affair and mine. I did not push Aaron. I just told him to give the subject of forgiveness some thought. The subject of the affair did not come up for several weeks, and I was careful not to bring it up. I wanted Aaron's internal processes to go uninterrupted. What I did notice was that Aaron was much more forthcoming in the sessions. He talked more freely, and both of them reported that their satisfaction level had increased. Finally, after they reported a particularly good week, I asked Aaron how he was doing with forgiving himself. We got married right out of college, he replied. We were just kids playing house. Neither of us had the slightest idea how to make a relationship work. When things got a little rough, I took the easy way out. I asked him if he was ready to hear about some of Laura's pain, and he agreed. Laura was more than ready. The thing that pisses me off more than anything is that he's used my affair to justify his all these years. I mean, you lied to me about where you'd been for months. The only reason I slept with someone else was to get back at you, to show you how it feels, but you were loving somebody, telling her things you should have been telling me. Laura was sobbing now, her body shaking. Aaron, too, looked extremely distressed. His worst fears were coming true. Laura would never forgive him, and he felt his own anger at Laura's accusation that he felt justified, when in fact he didn't. I stopped Aaron from reacting and told him quietly that the truth didn't matter now, that there was an opening for him to try and repair the hurt he'd caused Laura, and that to do that he had to listen to her feelings. Aaron was not an articulate speaker, especially when he was upset, but when I asked him to tell Laura what he was hearing, he managed to convey to her that he understood how betrayed she felt. For Laura, Aaron's message over the last 5 years that we just have to put the past behind us and go on was very threatening. She desperately needed Aaron to mirror her hurt feelings, and his refusal was like being abandoned all over again. So it was very hard for her now to take in the possibility that Aaron would be offering her something new. You see, this was a pivotal moment in the forgiveness process. The room was charged with new possibilities and old threats. I decided to stop to step in and help Aaron and Laura with their confusion. I explained that the process of forgiveness started with a few little successes and a lot of false steps. I also told them that nothing could undo the past, and that the point was merely to repair the hurt enough to move on. The real repair, I told them, would come from living the next 5 years differently than they lived the last 5. Aaron and Laura struggled for many months. There were times when Laura, overcome with the feelings she had so long been suppressing, would bring up the affair again and again. It appeared to Aaron that she was obsessed with it, and at these times his fear that she would never forgive him seemed true. Then he would withdraw, and Laura's fears that he didn't care would be triggered. But eventually, they began to see even this struggle as part of their new relationship. Instead of having affairs or lapsing into years of angry silence, they would struggle with each other. It is this commitment to struggle together in the present, rather than to live in your own separate past, that is the essence of forgiveness. Some couples have incorporated a process for clearing out old issues. They spend a certain amount of time each month or at the end of each year discussing the ways they are still feeling hurt, and then they make a conscious effort to let go of them. One couple I know has their own ritual for New Year's. They write the leftover anger and complaints on pieces of paper and then burn them in the fireplace. So the love of Christ, which gave himself up for us, intending to purify us, washing us, cleansing us, making us holy by the reading and washing of the word. This is a picture of Jesus who is willing to help heal and deeply understand his bride. And it's the same kind of love that we're called to give one another, an empathetic and compassionate love. And I hope that you can take some of these ideas and insert just a little more empathy and compassion into your relationships. So that's all for now. We're going to come back next week, which will be our last sermon on marriage and our last sermon on the formation of love. We've been going at this topic since September, and we're going to finish it up next week. So we'll see you then, and I hope that you have a blessed, empathetic week. Go in peace.